Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Great Conversations. Today I'm joined by Zach Stepek from Big Scoots, and we're both going to talk about hosting for hundreds, what agencies need to know before they grow. So this topic will be about hosting, most likely, and but specifically from an agency context and what you should think about when it comes to hosting not just one website, but many websites. And especially when they get bigger, what challenges are you looking at? And I think with Zach, we have a great guest here. Welcome, Zach.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to be here. Excited to join the ranks of all of the great guests you have had on this. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, awesome. So you've been an agency owner and you're also director of partner programs at Big Scoots. So you've seen basically both sides of this topic. One is an agency owner from the user perspective, if you will, and now from the perspective of a hosting company. And so before we dive into all of this tech and strategy, what goes wrong when agencies start scaling their hosting needs? What is a common thing that goes wrong?
There are a few things. One, when you look at hosts as partners and you're looking for a partnership, there are a lot of shiny things out there that look really great. And these hosting programs that promise you the world, and it's these partnerships are all designed to be a sales tool, right? The hosting company is trying to sell more hosting plans. That's the underlying goal of most of these agency partnership programs. And so you have to kind of look past that and look beyond just the shiny features, the bullet points of what they're trying to sell you on. And remember that the underlying goal is for them to sell more hosting, right? So once you look at it through that lens, and you can kind of compartmentalize the things they're telling you that you'll get. It's really easy to compare feature for feature instead of comparing promise for promise. So that's really the biggest thing, is just making sure that you're focused on what the tech provides, what the platform provides, not necessarily just on what the partnership is promising you.
Okay, cool. So when you start for planning, what should you look out for? So if you have like just a couple sites, very small, but there is the possibility that they may grow into something bigger over time. What is something you need to look out for there?
So one of the things is to make sure that whoever you've chosen as your hosting partner can grow with your customers, right? So, some hosts have a growth ceiling. It just is built into who they are as a company. And once you hit that, you've reached the limit of what they can operationally support. And, so you need to know kind of where that growth ceiling is and have a scalability plan for what you're going to do for your customers if they move beyond where that growth ceiling is. There are other hosts that don't really have as much of a growth ceiling. You can grow a site to enterprise scale, but that may become price prohibitive or cost prohibitive because they have a very set standard in which they do things, or they're renting infrastructure from a cloud provider like Google or AWS or Open Metal or Azure, right? And so all of those have fixed costs that grow as the usage of those platforms increase. So it can grow exponentially to where you're spending thousands or tens of thousands of dollars a month on a hosting bill for a client that has a massively large site, or an e-commerce site that's featured on Shark Tank or Dragon's Den, right? These are things that cause massive traffic spikes. And if those things happen, you have to know, what exactly is the plan here. And with a lot of hosts, if you go over your limits, the cost of going over those limits is astronomical. And they do that because they want you to upgrade to a bigger plan, pay more per month. And that's, obviously that's the growth pattern for most hosting. But sometimes those overage charges can get gigantic. And if you're trying to manage everything yourself on AWS or Google Cloud, there's no way around those overages, right? If you go over what you're supposed to have, first of all, if you go over disk space or memory on those servers, they're just going to stop working.
Yeah, true.
That's just, you'll hit a wall and you'll get 500 errors and the site will go down. So that's kind of the difference between managed WordPress hosting, where you have somebody watching resources and making sure those things don't happen, and the kind of DIY, we give you a panel to manage your own hosting, or going even deeper into AWS or Google Cloud administration. The difference is you have people watching resources, making sure your site's going to stay live. So that's another consideration to make is, what does support look like at the company that we're talking to about hosting? Because support becomes a very important thing, unless you want to become an infrastructure expert, which, more power to you if you want to. But it's a journey. It is quite a journey to understand scaling a website at, massive traffic levels. So those are the things that I would, consider moving in, have a scalability plan, know where those limits are on the plans that you're on, know what plans you can move to, know what the cost increases are going to be. That way you can communicate all of that to your customers well before any of that becomes an issue.
Yeah, and I think that's important to know because, if you have a feeling, I mean, sometimes you just have very simple corporate websites that do not have an online shop or anything specific to it. They probably won't need any scaling at any point of time if you know, okay, it's just a company that does its business in a certain area or whatever. Mm-hmm. But as you said, when you have in a TV appearance or whatever specialty coming up, then it just goes down very quickly, because if people just want to know information and it's been broadcasted on TV or somewhere else, hitting YouTube channels, whatever, that site has to withstand a huge amount of traffic that comes in such a moment. So what do you think are the biggest red flags you see when an agency plans to host dozens or even hundreds of sites?
Well, I think one of the things is we've gotten in a habit as a community of following the example of hosts that offer what I call deeply discounted or bargain basement hosting, right? So a lot of agency owners who haven't experienced scale are, used to these prices that are, $3 to $5 a month, right? And what they're doing to achieve those prices is putting hundreds of websites on a single server. And so a lot of agency owners, when they get a hold of one of these panel companies, I used to work at Cloudways, right? When they get a hold of a panel company, they think, oh, I've got a VPS. I can put as many sites as I want on this thing. And then if it starts to slow down, at the point that starts to be an issue, then I'll scale up. And, they don't realize that if they hit that point, sites start going down before they have an opportunity to scale. So that's one of the big pitfalls that I see with people who are going to be running hundreds of sites. The other thing is, if you're running hundreds of sites, how are you managing the basics of those sites? Are you handling WordPress updates, plugin updates, theme updates? How are you making sure that core web vitals stay in check, right? So that ranking stays high. How are you handling, search engine optimization? How are you optimizing for AI? How are you, doing all of these various things? How are you handling accessibility concerns? How are you making sure that you have things in place for GDPR or other privacy laws that, we have these requirements that we have to meet now that are mandated by government entities. And so, um, there are so many little things that we have to worry about. And anytime you can pick a partner that can take some of that concern, some of that complexity, and they can just handle that for you, and you can trust them to handle that piece for you, it eases your burden as an agency owner. So, when I was looking for partners, when I was running my agencies, I was always looking for people that made my team better, that augmented what my team could do internally. And so that's why I chose the partners that I did, because they were equipped to be able to handle issues that I couldn't. And they made my life easier. And so those two things were really the most important. Did they make my life easier? Did they make my customers' lives better? If there were issues, how quickly did they respond? What was the, SLA for support? How quickly did issues get resolved? How quickly was I alerted to issues when they happened? And, so all of those things really mattered. And then when there was a large issue, like, for example, the whole reason I got into WooCommerce in the first place, which was, a friend calling me on Thanksgiving, my friend Noah, and saying, "Hey, my site's down. Can you help me?" I'd never touched his site before. And he had been interviewed by Jeff Joniak, the voice of the Chicago Bears, the football team in Illinois here. And they were playing against the Green Bay Packers, Wisconsin's football team. We're neighbors and rivals, right? So during that game, an interview with my friend Noah, who runs a veteran service organization called Oscar Mike, had aired during the pregame. And they got about 14 orders in, and the site crashed. And he didn't know why. He just didn't understand what was going on, because he had never run into that before, right? He had never hit those limits. And turns out they were on a VPS that was donated very graciously by a company out of Chicago. And it was underpowered for the level of traffic they were getting. And it was also Thanksgiving, and it was a smaller hosting company, and nobody was in the office because it was a holiday. And so there was nobody to call, couldn't get a hold of anybody at the hosting company to reboot the server. So about 4 hours later, we had it back up and running, because we had to figure out how to log into it, how to get into cPanel in order to reboot the server, how to do all these other things that we needed to do in order to get the site up and running again. And like I said, I had never touched the site before. So by the time we had done that, the window had unfortunately passed. And this veteran service organization that's a nonprofit lost some of the great opportunity they had there to, become a larger entity than they were and help more veterans. So I ended up working there for 18 months after that, rebuilding their site, optimizing it for performance. And that's how I ended up getting into that whole WooCommerce performance area. But the key is, you don't know what you don't know until you realize you need to know it. And so, having things like scalability plans, having all of those in advance of having an event like that happen, helps immensely.
So you already mentioned WooCommerce, and WooCommerce itself is a very resource-hungry plugin already, and you just need a good starting point with the hosting already to even run WooCommerce smoothly. And so when WooCommerce is a beast at scale, what are your top strategies for keeping it fast and stable when order volumes explode? So as you mentioned in your example, it was 14 orders, right? Just a very tiny number. And then the site went down because there was just too much traffic on it, which is not very much, 14 orders.
Well, and the funny thing is, in the root cause analysis, once we finally got in and figured out what had actually crashed the server, it wasn't PHP that crashed the server. It wasn't the database. that
Okay.
crashed the server. The hosting company, trying to be helpful, had put the email server for the entire organization on the same server, the same VPS.
Mm,
And WooCommerce
I see.
generates multiple emails per order. And so the email spool of outgoing email from the same server ran the VPS out of memory. And that took the site down. So if the email hadn't been there, they probably would have survived at least a little longer. They would have been able to handle 4 to 5 times the number of orders that they had at least. But the email ended up taking the entire server down. So, and that kind of transitions well into, what are my strategies for keeping it fast and
Mm,
stable? Uh, so WooCommerce is, as you said, a very complex plugin, and that's what happens when you put an entire e-commerce platform inside of WordPress, right?
yeah.
E-commerce is not a simple operation. It's something that has a lot of different things that all have to work in harmony, from product management to order management to payment processing, inventory management. All of these things have to work together, and there's 17 or 18 different systems at play there that all have to work in concert, like an orchestra. And so, if you try to fit an orchestra onto a tiny, tiny stage, you're going to have people trying to play in the wings and trying to play on the ground. And, there's just, so that's part of it, is that you have to have an environment that is meant for handling something at that size with that level of orchestration. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when you are running a high volume website, it generally uh, it has what I call a death by 1,000 cuts, which um, my brother is a fan of samurai films, has been for most of our life, and so I've seen a lot of samurai films, and there's this thing where the more you get cut, the worse things get, right? So
True.
as you're running one of these larger sites, small little cuts, even paper cuts, hurt. If you have a ton of them, it's going to hurt a lot.
Yeah.
So these tiny little cuts, these tiny little things that are affecting the performance of the site add up. And so when you have 100 or 150 decisions that were made that aren't necessarily great decisions, um, those may have a very minor impact on their own. But when you add them all together, it's a major impact, right? So, if you have 40 different things that have a 100 millisecond impact on page load speed, 40 things at 100 milliseconds each, that's a 4-second change, right?
Yeah. That's
So,
massive. People click away when it takes like 4 seconds to load for a website.
yeah, you have 3 seconds. That's the statistic that most people, including Amazon, have found, is that you have 3 seconds to make your first impression. And actually, you lose about 40 to 45% of your market if it takes longer than 2 seconds for your page to load.
Oh, wow.
So, that's just, it's huge. And so, when you're in a business where the entire site is transactional, the goal is to sell products or sell services or sell downloads, or anything that is transactional in nature, um, and you have all these little decisions that are having together a large impact, the biggest thing you can do, the best thing you can do, is start to reverse some of those decisions. So when a lot of people start out, they start out wanting the site to do everything, right? I want to process my orders through the site. I want to ship my orders to my customers, print my shipping labels. I want to do all of these things from inside the site. That may not necessarily be the best thing to do at scale. So when you take things and you move them outside of WooCommerce that don't necessarily have to be done inside WooCommerce, you free WooCommerce up to do its core task, which is show products to customers, let them add it to a cart, let them go from cart to checkout, let them pay you. Those are the most important functions of WooCommerce, those 4 things right there. And anything else that you're doing that doesn't support those things is something that can be done outside of WooCommerce just as well as inside. So, the optimization strategy for me is generally, let's get down to the basics. Let's make sure the basics of the site work really well. And then once we've done that, let's take a look at what we need, what we'd like to have, and what we can eliminate completely. And let's just build a T-chart of what those things are. Have a column for need to have, it's business critical. Nice to have, it's not business critical, but it supports the business well, and we'd like to have it. And things we just realize we added and don't necessarily add anything to the bottom line. Get rid of the entire don't need to have column, and you might have eliminated, 20 cuts of your 40, right? And then you go through and the nice to haves. Okay, how can we do this in a way that doesn't impact the site performance? And then you take those and move them to external services, SaaS products, other things, right? And so one of the big things we did with Oscar Mike is we moved to an external shipping solution. And that was, at the time we were using Ordoro, which is a company out of Austin, great company, Austin, Texas, a lot of fun, great team. And we were using them as our order processing. So we didn't log into WooCommerce anymore to ship an order. We were doing that in an external tool. And by doing that, we eliminated a whole bunch of load on the server for doing the order processing on the back end. Because the only thing that had to happen was a simple API call from them back to WooCommerce to say, this order shipped and here are the details. And that was it. So rather than having people in the WordPress admin making changes. And so these lessons, later on led to running even larger sites than Oscar Mike, significantly larger. Some of the largest WooCommerce sites that existed in the world before 2020 when I left my agency. And we had the largest WooCommerce subscription site as a customer for a while. That's Universal Yums. I believe they may still be the largest, but at the time they had 150,000 people on their subscription boxes.
That's
and and the orders renewed on the same day every month. So it was 150,000 orders that had to go through all on that day. When they first came to us, that process took 7 days of cron jobs.
Oh, wow.
And through some very great work that folks on the team did, like Gabor Jaworski, we brought that down to under 18 hours. And this was before high performance order storage, before any of the optimizations had really been done to Action Scheduler or any of the other things that sit behind the scenes that make all of those things work. So getting that down to 1/7 or less of the time that it used to take had a huge business impact. And then we had a grocery chain that we worked with that had hundreds of thousands of products because it was a full grocery store. And they had market-based pricing and market-based inventory. And we made all of that work. We had a deodorant company that started on the founder's dining room table and grew to have a 2 million person email marketing list. And we were keeping their servers up and running, so we were able to take those same basic lessons that I used on a much smaller site and apply them across numerous other sites. And it still stood the test of time across all of those. And of course, that wasn't all just me. I had a great team of people supporting me and doing all of that. In the end, I actually had my keyboard taken away because I'd hired people that were better at coding than I was. So, we got to a point where I was just kind of running the administrative side of the business and the sales and marketing. Um, but we were still, fundamentally doing the same things. We were optimizing sites for performance and um, eliminating some of those 1,000 cuts that slowed the site down one by one. So that's the key.
That's very interesting. So how do you decide for a client what is a nice to have on it, on what is a don't even know or don't even really need to? I mean, some things are very obvious that need to happen, but like I think oftentimes clients are just really wanting to have some things because they know it's on another shop that is their inspiration for their online shop. It just so happens so often. Um, how do you make those decisions? Like, is it anything you try to convince your clients to not do things, or do you also sometimes maybe had to give in and say, okay, we're doing this specific thing because you're asking for it, but then we do not do these three things, for example?
Yeah, so a lot of it is just getting to a point where you have a deep understanding of the customer's business, right? So, um, this is not a simple transactional relationship in any of these cases, right? These are much deeper relationships than maybe a smaller agency is used to, because you have to understand when the order happens, even beyond what the website is doing. How is an order processed? How is it picked? Do they warehouse their own goods? What are the things that happen after the sale? How does shipping tracking work? How do customers get those updates? How does inventory management happen? How is cycle counting happening to make sure that inventory is accurate? If you're using third-party logistics companies, how do they get the orders? Where does that integration lie? Is that a plugin that already exists, or is it an API we have to call, or do we just send them an email and hope they process the order? What level of interaction we have there? So it's really just about getting to a deep understanding of how the operations side of that business works. And part of what we did to do that was we would go on site with these e-commerce companies and watch them do what they were doing, watch them pack orders, watch them ship things, watch them, and participate in that process so that we understood at a deeper level what exactly it was we could do to support that. And so that's a big piece of it. The other thing is that it's really important to understand that in these cases, the customer is in the end going to be the person making the decision. The store owner will tell you yes or no as to whether or not something is a need to have, a nice to have, or a we don't need, right? And they are the arbiter of whether or not that is the case. So your job is to present your case for whether or not something should be in one of those categories in a way that is delicate, with understanding, with care, but also with a little bit of force sometimes, a little bit of trust in yourself and whether or not you're making the right recommendation. So you can't be afraid to push back a little if you know that something probably could be done better. But part of knowing that is you have to know how it can be done better too. So, and I think because of the formation of the team that we built with my former agency, multiple members of the team had been embedded in e-commerce companies, had actually run operations in e-commerce companies. So we understood at a deep level how these various systems needed to work together. So if you're an agency and you're just getting into that space, I think if you have customers already that are e-commerce customers, go out and work a few days with them. Just go out and pack orders and ship things and, do those things. And you'll gain a much deeper understanding and honestly a much deeper appreciation for what exactly it is they're doing.
Yeah, and I think it also helps understanding their processes to entirely and make sure that, okay, I now understand how they are working. Can this WooCommerce plugin, for example, really is it a good fit for this process, or is it maybe something else that needs to be chosen in this context?
Yeah, and the other key here is to know that the WooCommerce team is actually performance focused at this point, right? They spent a long time trying to serve the small, mom and pop store owners because that was where the most growth was. And, it was an understandable strategy at the time. And I was there, and agencies like ours were there running these much larger sites. And the WooCommerce team just wasn't focused on making those much larger sites work at that point, at quite the same level, right? And so there was a realization over time that things like high performance order storage were needed, because, inserting an order with the traditional way that WordPress does things, you can't bulk add post meta in WordPress, right? So post meta is a single call per record, and an order contained a minimum of 50 post meta calls. So inserting an order was 50 separate database calls.
51.
Yeah.
If for the order itself, and then the post meta on top. Yeah.
Yep. So you look at that and it's like, okay, at scale, let's say we're getting 100 orders a minute.
Oof. Yeah. That's a lot of database requests.
Exactly. So high performance order storage reduced that to 3.
Yep.
The order itself, an initial record, and then, all the post meta gets inserted into a single record now. And then plugins may add more to that, right? But the core is these 3 calls instead of over 50 now. And so, that performance difference means that with with less hardware than before, we can handle more traffic because high performance order storage does the work. The problem is, and the foundation that led to high performance order storage being a possibility, they first introduced the CRUD classes, create, retrieve, update, delete classes inside of WooCommerce in 2017. And that abstracted away the way that data was interacted with by WooCommerce core code in most cases. And then it took from then until 2024 for plugin authors to get the message that these CRUD classes, if you're not using them and we replace the way one of these data types is stored, everything's going to break. So they had to have an outreach campaign with plugin authors saying, we need you to use these CRUD classes, because if you don't, once we make high performance order storage, the default for new stores, which it is now, if you install the WooCommerce plugin as a fresh install, new store, high performance order storage is on by default. So
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's not for old stores, right? You have to migrate to it. But by all means, if you're listening to this and you have an older WooCommerce store and you haven't migrated to it yet, work with a team that understands high performance order storage, test it in a staging environment, and make the switch, because your growth ceiling goes from here up to here, right? So it's an important thing. And so we really we had to wait 7 years though for the industry to catch up to what had been done in 2017. And if anybody's been following me and my podcasting with Do the Woo for the last 7 years, or listening to me talk in the marketplace in general, you've heard me say that plugin authors need to update and support all of that so that these things work. But it was even a problem internally. Like there was, once all of that stuff came out, WooCommerce, its own reporting inside of WooCommerce didn't use the CRUD classes at first. So, it was it was an uphill battle. The change was there. The foundation had been laid. We still needed to build the walls. And then once the walls were built, we had to get all of the other people to come in and take care of, drywall and and mudding and, laying carpet and tile and putting in the appliances, right? It took 7 years to build this house, but we're finally at a point where now we have the house, right?
But it's at the end, it's all for performance, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, that was kind of where we were going with that. Was the WooCommerce team has a performance team inside of it now that is solely focused on performance across the board for all store owners. And so that's a huge thing. And it's really, really helpful to have them, standing with us now, helping make sure that these larger scale stores are successful. And I can tell you from conversations with leadership inside WooCommerce, that is absolutely where they are now. They want, stores to be able to operate at scale, and they want to, support that the best that they can.
So with WooCommerce itself also focusing on performance, I think it's also worth to mention that it's not just like WooCommerce that should look after performance. Like everyone has to do who creates websites, whether you're a freelancer or an agency. And I remember that especially when working with WooCommerce, like caching is a bit of a pain in the ass, if you will say so. And do you have any tips which database and caching strategies actually work for larger WooCommerce stores?
Yeah, so there are a few things that work really well. One, if you have page caching enabled, obviously it's going to help with the less dynamic portions of a WooCommerce site. There are points where page caching won't work, like the cart, the checkout, anything that's in that dynamic process that happens, at the end of the sale. The cart itself can't really be cached, so the session, making sure the session integrity across everything that's cached is solid is important.
Yep.
So my first recommendation is always to make sure that the site is performant without caching on, because putting a Band-Aid on something that is bleeding, if the Band-Aid isn't big enough, it's still going to bleed. So we want to make sure that everything is as performant as we can make it. We've optimized deeply, and then we can layer things like caching on top. And so, there are multiple ways we cache within WordPress. There's, object caching, which caches queries to the database, right? And we do that a lot of the time with Redis or Memcache. I personally am a fan of Redis Object Cache, and Till Cruz has done great work with Object Cache Pro and with Relay and really optimizing the way that object caching works in WordPress. So those are some of my recommendations there. Then we have page caching, which caches the result of what PHP has executed, right? So the PHP is done executing. We've generated what becomes at that point a static page. We can cache that result so that we don't have to go back to the database to make that same thing again. And then the third layer of caching is edge caching. So we can use a content delivery network, and we can cache the results of these pages at the edge. So using something like a Cloudflare, Bunny CDN, or some of these other resources where we can cache some of the site, or the static page cache, even in some cases, out at the edge, close to where the request is coming from. So the way content delivery networks work, and primarily, is we have an origin server, and then we have edge servers in multiple points of presence around the globe. And so when you deploy to an edge cache, those points of presence get a copy of those resources. And when somebody requests that resource from close to one of those points of presence, rather than going all the way back to the origin server multiple hops away from where that request is happening, we go to that edge server that's closer, and we get it from 1 or 2 hops away from where the visitor is. And so that can really optimize that process as well. There are other things that you can look at, but as far as caching, those 3 layers need to operate effectively, but they also have to operate in concert. They have to work together. So if you update a post or a page, you want to make sure then that when that page gets updated, when the hook for that happens in WordPress, whoever you're using or whatever stack you're using listens for that hook and invalidates the cache across all 3 layers. Because if it doesn't, you end up with stale content. Stale content leads to problems, right? So those are really the keys there. Those 3 layers do work really well together. The other thing on the database side that I will mention is that there is a point where a single database server may not be effective anymore, right? So when you get to a certain scale, you may need to horizontally scale your database servers. And there are a number of ways to do that. And most of those ways result in something called replication lag. And replication lag is really bad on an e-commerce site, because if an order gets inserted into one of the database servers, and then the next request comes in to display the confirmation page that confirms the order by querying the order, and in that time period, the traffic has dictated that the load balancer move that request to a different database server, but that database server doesn't have the order, well, what's going to happen?
There's no confirmation, I guess.
There's no confirmation. The page errors out because the record doesn't exist. So there are a number of ways that we can approach this. The easiest way, in my opinion, is to use a Galera cluster, which allows you to have a master setup where a write has to happen to all of the replica servers at the same time. That way everything stays in sync, but you still get the benefit of being able to distribute load across multiple servers. So that's kind of the best case scenario still for handling data at scale. But as long as you have those kinds of things in place, you're going to be able to achieve tremendous scale with these WooCommerce sites.
And I think it's not just like about WooCommerce sites, but also larger websites in general. So anything performance related can also be applied to a website that is not running WooCommerce, but like instead, I don't know, has maybe is a multilingual website or is like spread across many countries or many markets, different markets even. Doesn't have to be a one-to-one translated website. So in case everyone notices that we're just talking about WooCommerce, it's like this is where websites scale up massively, but they can also apply to anything that is not a WooCommerce website, but still a large website for whatever reason. And in the business to business world, there's like lots and lots of different websites that are not WooCommerce websites, but still maybe have their own custom system for whatever reason.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of things that I say about WooCommerce that just apply to WordPress in general. We generally deal with those things more in WooCommerce than anywhere else, but large learning management systems, large content sites, millions of posts, these are all things that that have similar load needs or hardware needs. So The other thing that I didn't mention before is there is another way you can cache some data that people don't always think about when they're thinking about strategies. Um, 10up has an open source plugin called Elastic Press that allows you to use
Yeah.
Elastic as a way to store data, mainly posts and that are in your WordPress posts tables. And the thing that Elastic does really well is it does search really, really well. So SQL is not really great at search. It's a great for creating relational data. It's great for storing that data. But if you are searching that data deeply, it doesn't do that incredibly well. It's not
Yeah,
efficient.
that's true.
So Elastic, on the other hand, is really good at searching across millions of records very quickly. So when we've been working with sites that have a ton of products or a ton of posts, tons of content, if you put that into Elastic, it's more searchable. But the other thing that Elastic Press does that people don't really talk about as much is that it overrides the WP query. So anytime a query would be happening to a post, it replaces that with an Elastic query. And so even your category pages and other things that rely on WP query on the site gain the benefit of those much faster search results. So you can go from searches that take seconds to searches that take, 100 to 150 milliseconds. And that drastically changes the performance of a site.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a huge change. That's true.
Yeah. So it's cool that there are so many tools that we can employ for things like that.
Yeah, that's great. And performance isn't just like one dimensional. And as you said, there are many different ways of improving the performance. And I think this is still something that we need to still mention, because I often also get to hear, yeah, but I need to improve the performance of my site, even if it's just a freelancer. And it's like, yeah, it's not just a plugin you install or a button you press, then your site is performant. It's unfortunately not as easy as that. So, yeah, but that's very interesting. I didn't know this about Elasticsearch, that it replaces the queries, like all the queries. So it's good to know, actually.
Yeah, it's a really cool side effect of using it, is that it just speeds up all of the queries that are querying the post table. So
Yeah.
pretty cool.
Okay, so let's move on to workflows a little bit. So what does a healthy deployment process look like when you're managing a lot of sites? Do you have any suggestions there?
Yeah, actually I do. So there are a number of things that we can take from the more traditional software development workflows, the software development life cycle that a traditional developer would use. And so things like, continuous integration, continuous deployment, CI/CD tools, these help out a lot. And as long as you are managing, as you grow your agency, you're going to have more developers that are touching the same files. So having things in version control as agencies grow, uh, being able to track where changes are coming from, being able to handle conflicts when they inevitably arise when two people work on the same file. If that's not in a version control system and you are cowboy coding directly on the server, you end up with people overwriting each other's work. And I will tell you that is a terrible waste of time and resources, and very frustrating to both of the developers who just spent time working on a feature.
That is true. Yeah.
So, having some kind of version control system, whether that's GitHub or Subversion or any of the Git related tools, you can use GitLab, you can use any of the other hosted solutions there. But having a version control system and managing change matters a ton. And then going from version control to a tagged release and using that tagged release as a deployment trigger, and that deployment trigger being the only way code gets to production. So everything else can happen in staging, right? Let people deploy their new code to staging all day long, or build individual staging environments for each branch, and have dev staging environments for each branch. But and that's probably another thing that should be talked about at some point. But Git flow and branches for each feature, having some kind of way to track feature development and have things in these compartmentalized commits inside of version control matters too. But then deploying from your version control repository using a continuous deployment tool, and then having that pushed to production. That's the enterprise workflow that we all dream of, right? Is the ability to work with a large team and use all of those tools to funnel into one release that's a coordinated release of all these features. And we've tested that all these features work together, that there are no conflicts. We've gone through and run all of the automated testing because we wrote test cases. All of these things are working correctly, and now we can deploy and we go to production. Having that be the only way that code changes in production is really helpful. That does make it harder for, say, clients to update their own plugins if you don't have a way to pull those changes back in. But there are a couple of different ways to handle that. One is don't version the plugins that they're going to need to update. That works to a point. The other is to just make sure that you constantly are keeping your development environments in sync with production for plugins by watching what updates have happened. Have something watching the WP content plugins folder on the server and notifying you when anything changes. That way you can go and grab those changes back and integrate them into your dev branches. So those things make sense. I like shutting those updates down completely and just committing them through version control. That's the better way long term, but it's not as manageable on the client side. So, there are just multiple ways to handle that. There are some tools out there from companies that allow you to look at, multiple sites in one environment and kind of see everything that's going on, across multiple sites in one location. I mean, there's this thing called Greyd Hub, I guess, that does that too. You might have heard of it. But being able to manage plugin updates in a quick and easy location like that is really helpful. There are other tools that do the same thing, but maybe in a different way. And I find that those tools are really helpful for managing a large number of sites as well.
Yeah, I think it also maybe depends a little bit on the client themselves. Like, do they want to do updates on their own, or are they completely fine to have them version controlled and be updated for a fixed, let's say, every week or every 2 weeks or every month, depending on like how much is going on their website. And I think it's also like the website itself. Some may need very regular maintenance, and some are fine if they're just being there for a month and not being updated. Of course, for security updates, you should always go super quick and have them implemented.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's very much comes down to what is the project actually like, and it can depend there as well. What is the best solution to maintain the website?
Yeah, I mean, and on the security side, having things like patch stack in place helps a lot
Mm.
to ensure that things like these 0-day exploits that come out um, are already patched, right?
Yeah.
That's what patch stack does. They release tiny patches that fix problems in plugins that have not been addressed yet. And by having that kind of rapid response, generally you can beat the bad actors to even trying to attempt to use these on your sites. So
True.
it's
Yeah.
it's just yet another layer of security that you can add that just provides more defense, and then things like blocking bad bots and all of the other things that can be done at the edge so that the server is never even touched by bad actors with tools like Cloudflare Enterprise and just Cloudflare in general. Very helpful, very helpful. So yeah, I think those are key to making sure that your customers are as supported and secure as possible at all times.
All right. So now maybe let's move on to the topic of partnerships. So partnerships with of from agencies to, let's say, hosting companies. And how can agencies turn hosting from a cost factor to a business opportunity?
Well, you're speaking my language now. We've been on the same page the whole time, but yeah, this is what I do now, right? I run our partnership programs at Big Scoots. I've been involved in uh, agency partnerships now in the hosting space for a while, and what I find is that the biggest thing I was looking for as an agency owner is something that's honestly kind of difficult to find, and that is a true partner. Um, when I'm picking a partner that I want to work with, I want someone who is as invested in my success as they are in their own. And that's a hard thing to find. It honestly is. Um, a lot of these partnership programs that are out there are really just an affiliate program by a different name.
Mhm. Yeah.
And, you know, while while the partner programs that I'm running right now do include an affiliate component, because that's what creates the recurring revenue, we're approaching it a little differently. And we're doing that by making sure that that commission is not a single time thing, right? We're invested in keeping that profit sharing component moving forward. So as customers are signed up through our agency partners, those agencies get a recurring commission. And that recurring commission is for initially 2 years because they are an agency partner. So, and then as long as they remain active with us, we're planning to extend that beyond that. So, um, commission structures are great. That's how you turn, hosting from just a very simple, cost line on your P&L to something that can be considered an asset and a profit center for your agency. But the other thing that really does matter as part of that profit analysis for hosting is how much time is it taking of your day to manage that relationship, right? Are you still having to go in and fix problems for your customers when they happen? If they're things that the host could very easily fix themselves. And so that's why, things like managed WordPress matter so much for agencies because a managed WordPress provider, a host, can take a lot of the load off of the agency for managing that customer relationship on the infrastructure side. And, some hosts go above and beyond that and do other things that are ancillary to hosting that help with those agency relationships as well. For example, one of the things that we offer is a performance services package where we'll monitor core web vitals and make sure your customers stay, in the top percentages of their core web vitals, sitting in that 95 and above percent score in all of those core web vitals, and making sure not only do the scores look good, but in performance, in practice, the performance is actually matching what the scores say, because sometimes the scores are more of a vanity metric than anything. But actually making sure that they're really doing those things, and doing that on a monthly cadence and on an ongoing basis with alerts that tell us when things change. So, those are ways that we can support our agency partners beyond just, we're a really good host with great support. So those are the things that I looked for when I was an agency owner first. How good was the support? And when I wrote in chat, or if I called, or if I opened a ticket, did I have more knowledge about what was going on than the hosting company's support people did? And there were a number of instances where I did have more knowledge than the host company did, and that may not have been a good partnership for me. So, and how quickly does it take to get from in an environment where there are tiered support reps, to get from that entry level to somebody who can actually diagnose and fix your issue? If you have to go through 3 levels of support to get there, and each of those transitions, each time that the ticket is forwarded on to another level of support, do you have to wait an hour, 2 hours? If you're in an emergent situation where the site is down, is it taking you 6 hours to get to the right person to fix that? That's a problem.
Take that long. Yeah.
Right. That's a problem if that's the case. So, what's the SLA for support? And one of the things that I've loved as I've gotten into my role here at Big Scoots is that we have a 90-second SLA for support tickets. So responding to a support request in under 90 seconds is the expectation, and it's actually the norm. We have we consider support to be a very important thing. So I found in the places I was looking to work, I was looking for the same dedication to support that I had wanted when I was an agency owner. And I believe the last 2 places I've been have really both embodied that. At Convesio, support was a very important thing. And now at Big Scoots, support is the most important thing. The way we treat our customers is the guiding light for the entire company. And it shows, when you have a net promoter score of 95 for the year as an average, and some of your support reps have a 100 for the year, which is nearly unheard of. It really shows that culturally support matters here. So, even if you're not with us, I want you to look at support as an agency owner as one of the key things. So support, stability, speed, and scale. Support's first. Stability is second. What's the uptime look like? Can they keep your site up and running even through these massive traffic events? Security. Are they going to keep your customers secure? Are they going to keep your customers' secure? Right? And then speed. Are the servers fast? Do they, can their hosting handle the workloads that you're throwing at it? And those 4 things are the S's that I think about when I'm looking at a hosting partnership. And you really are looking for a partner. If what you're getting is a vendor, you don't have a partnership, right? If the people you're talking to when you have an issue are salespeople, if the only contact you have with the hosting company is with a department that is a sales department, and they're just telling you to spend more money, that's not a partnership. That's a vendor. So we strive to be a partner, not a vendor. And that's, if you look back even back in 2015 when I gave my first WordCamp talk, that was one of the points on there that I used was find a partner, not a vendor. And it still rings true today.
Yeah, I think it's very important because like hosting is like, if you have no hosting, then you have no website. So essentially it is the basement you're working on, and like the ground floor, basement, ground floor, whatever. You know what I mean? It's the base that the website is running on, and if it doesn't work, you not you, but also your client loses money eventually if they are having a shop on it or whatever. Even if it's just a regular website, if it cannot be reached, then there's just nothing you can do, and no business can be done.
Yeah, and I encourage business owners to look at hosting in the same way that they look at physical space. So if they were trying to open a retail store, for example, you don't want your retail store to be in a back alley somewhere. You don't want it to be in somebody's closet, right? You don't want to have to go through somebody's living room to get to it. Trust me, there are actually hosting companies that exist that it's a server in the owner's closet. Like that's a reality. It does happen. But they bill themselves as a full-scale hosting company, right? And that's not frequent. It does happen though. I've seen it before. So when you're looking for a retail space, you're not looking for this back alley nondescript door. You're looking for, the place on Madison Avenue in New York or on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, right? You want frontage. You want a place where people are going to be able to get to your location and they're going to be able to come in, and it's beautiful and things are efficient. They run well. And when you're looking at hosting, really, you're looking at digital real estate. True, and that digital real estate matters. So, do you want your digital real estate to be in some back alley? Or do you want your digital real estate to be, in a premium location in a tier 3 data center that has, all of the power backup and redundancy capabilities that you need? Do you want a host that understands the layout of their infrastructure at a deep level because they run their own servers? Or do you want to, rent space from somebody else who's renting space? And this is something that I think is a really important distinction to make, because a lot of hosting companies, they've built on top of Google Cloud or AWS. And so they're renting space from Amazon or Google and then reselling that space to you. You are subletting your hosting environment. And so if you wouldn't do that for your physical location for your business, why would you do that for your virtual location? And that's so, true.
It's a very good question.
Just looking at those things, and so I have, the privilege of working for a company that has our own data centers. I have badged biometric access to go look at the server racks that our sites are in. We have locations in the Chicagoland area. In Chicago, we're downtown Chicago by McCormick Place. We have a location in Elk Grove Village that we just spun up, which is just outside of where O'Hare International Airport is in Chicago. We have a location in Virginia that we're spinning up. We have presence in England. We have presence in Germany that we're expanding. But those are our servers. It's our hardware. And because of that, we can physically locate a physical database server next to a physical web server, network the two together directly at 400 gigabit per second on a 400 gigabit backbone that sits, that's tied to the best data providers in the world and goes through Cloudflare with a direct fiber connection to Cloudflare's network. So these are things that, when you're renting from somebody who's also renting, when you're subletting your server space, they can't do that. These companies can't call Amazon and say, "Hey, AWS team, can you physically put this server next to this server?" It's just not what it's built for.
Yep.
It's not how it works. So, when you are running a premium business and you want premium digital real estate, you have to find a premium provider. And there are very few of us left that run our own infrastructure.
So it's a great idea to look specifically out for partnerships that does provide this real estate. And as you said, it's not just like a vendor, but a real partnership, because you are, as a hosting company, just as invested in making this business that comes to you as a customer, help them also grow and get even better.
Yeah.
And not just like taking their money and here are some servers, have fun.
Yeah. I mean, it goes way beyond that. And, if all you want is that transaction, that's great. That's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's what you want to build your business around, more power to you. I did it. I did it for a long time until I found hosting partners I trusted. But it's just a lot of work. And if that's what you love doing, if you love managing infrastructure, do it. But if you don't want to, then just find somebody you can trust to do it. And there are a lot of great options out there for companies that are really good at doing this well. And we're not the only ones. I'm a little partial because of where I work, because I do think we're pretty awesome, but we're not the only ones that do this well. And there are benchmarks that come out every year that are done by Kevin Ohashi from Review Signal, the WordPress hosting benchmarks. And they're a great indicator of where some of the performance is from these companies. How can they handle load at scale? So really good to look at as kind of an independent view into what these hosts can actually handle. And proud to say that after, BigScoots has been around for 15 years. It's only the last 2 that people have really been hearing the name because they grew by word of mouth for 13 years. And, our chief marketing officer, Tim Monner, started just over 2 years ago now. And so that's when, the push into the market has really started with actively marketing to the WordPress space. But they've been doing WordPress hosting for 13 years. And a lot of content creators have been on BigScoots for a long time. So, kind of cool to see, the impact in the marketplace already. And, it's just really, really neat to be a part of this journey and start to get, agencies to a point where they have a partner they can trust. So if you don't have that yet, look me up. If you don't want to work with us for some reason, look me up. I'll help you find somebody who you want to work with. I have always been about serving the community, and that's what I want to keep doing. So, if we're not the right fit, I'll help you find one.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I think we can wrap up here. I have one final question for you, and this one is: where do you think high volume WordPress hosting is headed next?
It's interesting because one of the things we've seen really change in the last couple of years is we've seen a lot of traffic coming in from AI consuming the content that we make, right? And so one of the largest traffic sources for sites is all of these bots now that are just eating content. So I think that on one hand, one of the things we're going to see high volume hosts doing is prioritizing that traffic, prioritizing user traffic above these bots and other services that are just consuming. And we'll see, an increased focus on whether or not those individual customers or companies want AI to be consuming their content. So that's an area of tuning that we're really focused on right now, is making sure that good bots can get in, bad bots are not allowed, and that these really bad actors, because some of these AI companies, they just don't care how much traffic they throw at you. We've had customers go over bandwidth just based on this AI bot traffic. And luckily,
crazy.
Luckily, we have a policy where we don't penalize customers for non-sustained traffic like that. So we'll help them block it at the edge so that it stops happening. And we have a list of the ones that do bad things, and we can automatically kind of add those in. Cloudflare's been doing a lot of work with AI as well, trying to stem the tide of this traffic wave that's happening, because the point of AI systems is to consume all knowledge and be able to regurgitate it, right? So yeah, that's a big thing, is how do we stem the tide of this AI traffic wave? That's one thing. Another thing we're going to see, I think, is an increased focus on the way that performance occurs across the entire WordPress stack. So the WordPress team has a performance team. The WooCommerce team has a performance team. There's hosting companies that are focused on performance optimization, and the hosting team inside Make WordPress has been focused on how can we create a stack that's more performant overall, and what can we do together to push the industry forward. So I think this focus as an industry on supporting mid-market and enterprise workloads is going to pay dividends across all sites in the long run. And then I think we'll see more specialty hosts that emerge, that are really good at doing high scale WordPress. Before I was at Big Scoots, I was at Convesio for 18 months, and Convesio is containerized WordPress built to scale horizontally. And when that's a necessary thing, when you get to that level of scale, if you can't just deploy more hardware, which we can do really effectively at Big Scoots. One of the things I love is we can deploy a 200 core server if we need to. So that's kind of the other side of the coin, is where is that growth ceiling? How high can you go before you hit the limit of what's available? And with us, we can do a lot with a single server. With other companies, they can't do as much with a single server, so they have to start to scale horizontally earlier. And so containerization helps a lot with that. So we're going to see more of these specialty hosts that are really good at handling specific workloads at scale. And I think we'll see the investments that are happening into things like WP Cloud and WordPress VIP on the automatic side really start to feed into the open source project more as well, because they're learning things that they maybe hadn't known before, as well as they grow and scale across all of the automatic owned hosting brands as well. So, I think we're going to see more growth than ever in high volume WordPress hosting, and I hope that we continue to see growth in the platform in general, providing the content management system of choice to these large publications. We've got a lot of large publications on us already as far as WordPress as a platform, but I think there's still more room for growth there. And with some of the tools that are out there, obviously, if you're listening to Greyd Conversations, you're aware of one of them that's making publishing easier for companies. But there are a lot of people who are focused on this world of trying to enable these larger scale businesses, franchises, other companies that have these enterprise needs to come into the WordPress space and really thrive here. So those are the things that I think are coming in the near future.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zach. So we're at the end of our episode today. Thank you so much for taking the time and for this wonderful conversation we had. And everyone, see you in the next episode.
Thanks for having me.